What if they're able to pull off Markkanen? Do you think there's a good chance they're going to move him? Because
Lauri Markkanen of the Utah Jazz. Utah's not sure it wants to trade him.
A huge NBA trade is about to shake up the entire landscape of the NBA and once again quite possibly make the next version of the OKC Thunder while simultaneously making an incredibly deep Western Conference even deeper. So before we get to the content, we are less than 35,000 subscribers away from getting to 1 million subscribers. If you want to subscribe and turn on our notifications so you can help us reach that goal, that would mean the world to me. Now that we get all that out of the way, cue the intro. Mic check 1 2 1 2. What's going on, everybody? We recently made a video on how the OKC Thunder got an offer that they couldn't refuse during the 2019 offseason. After a gentleman's sweep in the first round of the playoffs, which ended with Damian Lillard doing this.
Lillard, long range three, and it's good!
The Oklahoma City Thunder received a godfather offer for Paul George, a trade that in hindsight just looks so incredibly one-sided. As you guys know, the OKC Thunder received LA's unprotected first-round picks in 2022, 2024, and 2026, along with a 2021 and 2023 first-round selection from the Miami Heat, and the options to swap picks in 2023 and 2025. But on top of that, they also got Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Danilo Gallinari, and honestly, just Shai Gilgeous-Alexander for Paul George straight up was one-sided. They're also able to get their budding star point guard some veteran leadership help. They traded Russell Westbrook to the Houston Rockets for a top 4 protected 2024 and 2026 first round pick, a top 20 protected 2025 pick swap, and a 2021 pick swap that was also protected. In addition to that, they also got Chris Paul. People thought that Chris Paul was going to get bought out, but they kept him on the roster and then would eventually flip him to the Phoenix Suns a year later. Why am I mentioning this? Well, the OKC Thunder created a brand new model, and it was a model that didn't necessarily need to succeed in order for other teams to catch on, because you don't need to take that deep of a dive into history to know that it would work. In our Los Angeles Clippers video, How to Ruin a Team in 5 Seconds, we also discussed how the Boston Celtics pretty much did the same thing a few seasons prior, trading their aging core of Kevin Garnett, Jason Terry, and Paul Pierce to the Brooklyn Nets so they could get 3 unprotected first-round picks, a trade that would eventually get them Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. With that being said, it didn't take very long for other teams to follow suit. The most recent team, of course, being the Utah Jazz. Teams that are somewhat competitive are able to make it to the second round of the NBA playoffs, but clearly hit a wall. The Utah Jazz were an incredible regular season team, but once they got into the playoffs, they were mismatched consistently. The best example I could give you is look no further than the 2021 playoffs, when the Utah Jazz faced off against the Los Angeles Clippers in the conference semifinals. The Jazz were incredibly mismatched when it came to facing off against the Los Angeles Clippers, primarily because they didn't really know how to go small, because no matter what, Rudy Gobert was mismatched. And the epitome of this was Game 6 of the 2021 Western Conference semifinals, aka the Terrence Mann game, the game where Terrence Mann was just sitting in the corner wide open and went off for 39 points off of 7 of 10 shooting from 3 and 15 of 21 from the field. So the Utah Jazz eventually decided to pivot, moving on from Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell at a time where they could have just held on to them even longer if they wanted to, but they decided to trade them while they had leverage. You have to admit, what Danny Ainge did a decade before the trade is something he's trying to replicate once again, trading Donovan Mitchell to the Cleveland Cavaliers for Lauri Markkanen, Colin Sexton, Ochai Agbaji, 3 unprotected first round picks, and 2 unprotected pick swaps. And this becomes really interesting because if Donovan Mitchell somehow joins a new team, either this summer or next summer, then the Utah Jazz are in business. You have unprotected firsts from a team that isn't going to be that competitive. And of course, they also traded Rudy Gobert for 4 first-round picks and a pick swap, Walker Kessler, and some role players. And there's a lot of similarities in both of these rebuilds. In both cases, the above-average player that they acquired ended up turning into a star sooner than they thought. But in the case of the OKC Thunder, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander was just 21 years old when he was acquired, whereas Lauri Lauri Markkanen, who wasn't supposed to be a star by the way, was 25 years old when he was acquired. So there's this question of making sure that the rebuilding window is consistent, that your best player is ready to compete at the same time as all the other players on your team. And when you take a look at the Western Conference, the Utah Jazz have a little bit of a problem. And I've cited this problem multiple times when I make videos about the Los Angeles Lakers. This past year, the Utah Jazz finished with a 31-51 record. Now, granted, Lauri Markkanen only played in 55 games, but when you take a look at the depth of the Western Conference and how each and every team literally got better, you don't need to be a genius to realize that there's a good chance that they might be even worse after this year. I mean, the OKC Thunder traded for Alex Caruso. The Denver Nuggets didn't really do anything too crazy yet. The Minnesota Timberwolves were able to trade for Rob Dillingham and also sign Joe Ingles. So the deepest team in the West got even deeper. The Los Angeles Clippers got way worse, but the Dallas Mavericks got significantly better with the acquisition of Klay Thompson on a relatively inexpensive contract. The Phoenix Suns are always going to be up there because, well, you have Bradley Beal, Kevin Durant, and Devin Booker, and who knows, maybe Coach Bud could turn that team around. I think the Los Angeles Lakers clearly got worse, but the New Orleans Pelicans traded for DeJounte Murray and didn't really have to give up much in return. He was literally donated to them. And then the Sacramento Kings just acquired DeMar DeRozan. The Golden State Warriors are a team that we're going to come back to, and the Houston Rockets made a huge run over the latter part of this past year, and that's before we mention how the Memphis Grizzlies are going to get John Morant back, and the San Antonio Spurs added Chris Paul, Harrison Barnes, Stephon Castle to a team that has Victor Wembanyama on it. So who knows, maybe they make it to a play-in. When you are the Utah Jazz and you're taking a look at all of this, there's a problem. It doesn't look like you're going to be able to be competitive for another couple of years at the very minimum. If there's a time to start bottoming out and trying to get the next great player, which by the way, Cooper Flagg is that next great player and he's going to be entering the NBA draft next year, it would be now. With that being said, you built up Lauri Markkanen's value to an incredible point. Lauri Markkanen wasn't seen as the player as he is now. He was pretty much seen as a very high volume, low efficiency big man when he was with the Cleveland Cavaliers and the Chicago Bulls. His defense was weak. He wasn't necessarily the strongest on the boards. And aside from one season in Chicago, for the most part, his 3-point percentage was in the mid 30%. He gets traded to the Utah Jazz and that all changes. He becomes the most improved player in the 2022 to 2023 season, averages 25.6 points per game off of 39% shooting from beyond the arc, and that's despite him shooting more threes. So he's on a team that is really padding his stats to the point where his offensive box plus minus with the Cleveland Cavaliers in that lone season was a 0.4, but when he went to Utah, it was a 4.9 in year one and a 5.1 in year two. So going back to our analogy with the OKC Thunder, you start to realize that Lauri Markkanen isn't supposed to be the Shai Gilgeous-Alexander of this team. He might be the Chris Paul of this team. Now, of course, Chris Paul was significantly older when he was traded from the Houston Rockets to the OKC Thunder, but it was the same concept. Chris Paul was pretty much a buyout candidate, but the OKC Thunder opted to keep him for a season, built up his value, and eventually traded him to the Phoenix Suns for Ricky Rubio, Ty Jerome, Kelly Oubre Jr., Jalen Leck, and a 2022 first-round pick. Better than nothing. And in the case of Lauri Markkanen, he's pretty much in that situation, but on steroids. He went from a player that was a role player, that was a volume scorer, but a defensive liability in Chicago, all the way to a player that literally could have an offense running through him. A 7-footer that could stretch the floor and fit into any prototypical pace and space offense. So as a result, the demand for him has been substantial because Lauri Markkanen is also going into his contract year. And this is a good thing and a bad thing. So far, we know that the demand in Markkanen was crazy. The moment the Warriors lost Klay Thompson, they said this.
The one player that a number of teams have tried to target, Lauri Markkanen of the Utah Jazz. Utah's not sure it wants to trade him, but they have to listen. They've been listening. And a lot of the teams who lost out on Mikal Bridges from Brooklyn have transferred over to trying to see if they can land Lauri Markkanen out of Utah. Golden State is one of those teams.
I think it's hilarious whenever you're losing your franchise cornerstone of the past decade, you come out and say,
Hey, don't worry guys, we're trying to get a better version of Klay Thompson that is 7 foot and way younger.
And it wasn't the Warriors that were the only interested team. The Sacramento Kings were extremely interested in Lauri Markkanen. Could you just imagine Domantas Sabonis and Lauri Markkanen as a front court? According to Anthony Slater, Slater of The Athletic, the Sacramento Kings went hard after Lauri Markkanen before DeMar DeRozan. The Kings went hard after Utah's Lauri Markkanen earlier this week, protecting Keegan Murray in the discussions, but putting on the table what they believe was a substantial enough picks-based offer. They put a deadline to their side of the deal, needing an answer quickly considering the urgency of the dissolving market. Good move by the Sacramento Kings. Obviously, that trade didn't happen, which means that the prime contender for Lauri Markkanen's services would be the Golden State Warriors, who in my opinion, this is the best player that they could acquire throughout the entire offseason. There's no question about it. Better than Paul George in my opinion. No offense to Paul George, he's a great get for the Philadelphia 76ers. He's a player that each and every team could use. I definitely have reservations paying him the amount that he was paid, especially considering the fact that he just turned 34 years old and the fact that he doesn't necessarily have the cleanest track record. With that being said, him joining the Eastern Conference and joining one of the better teams in the Eastern Conference, who's having a remarkable offseason by the way, gives me a lot of confidence about his potential success, and I think it was the perfect move for him. If the Warriors were to get him, I think it would just make a marginal difference. I mean, again, I listed all of the Western Conference teams for you guys. It's a huge uphill battle to try to win the West. Whereas in the East, you just really need to be able to beat the Boston Celtics and maybe the Milwaukee Bucks if they aren't a trash heap like they were last year. But they have Doc Rivers as a head coach, so but Lauri Markkanen would be a seamless fit for the Golden State Warriors. He's going into his age 27 season, which means he still has a lot of good years left, and it makes so much sense for a trade to happen between the Warriors and the Jazz. But there's just one big problem. Listen to what Brian Windhorst said in regards to Lauri Markkanen during his podcast.
What if they're able to pull off Markkanen? Would you change your mind?
I mean, obviously, if they could get a guy like Markkanen, that would help because he is
depends on what
dynamic
they're trading for him. I mean,
right, and it depends on what their roster looks like after. But certainly, if you had a guy like Lauri Markkanen, who's a big movement shooter, that would be a really good piece. But again, like that's a big swing. Maybe they could pull that off, but
there's some other teams that are looking at Markkanen. I think San Antonio is one of them.
I was going to say that to me would be a much more intriguing situation for Markkanen because of the way he would perfectly complement Wemby, and just the Spurs are loaded up on picks. That would be one heck of an addition if the Spurs want to be aggressive. It will like Markkanen's not going to be traded for any sort of discounts, just to be clear. Like it's going to be a heck of a pack.
Yeah, but the teams who are negotiating with the Jazz do think there's a good chance they're going to move him, because sometimes Danny Ainge, as Bontemps has detailed over the years when he was with the Celtics, will act like he's gonna do a trade and then there's no trade.
Right.
And maybe that'll happen again here.
So the Utah Jazz have a plethora of options. I mean, the first option is trade with the Golden State Warriors. And the Golden State Warriors actually had a heavily pick-based offer on the table for Lauri Markkanen. According to T. Jones NBA, he thinks that the offers are heavily pick-based, and what complicates it is that the Warriors only have 2 unprotected picks plus a protected first-round pick. Now, bear in mind, the Warriors have a difficult decision to make. Essentially, what they would have to do is give up an unprotected draft pick in a year like 2027 or 2029. And the issue with that is Steph Curry is currently 36 years old, and he's going to turn 37 years old in March. So clearly the time is ticking for the Golden State Warriors, but at the same time, Steph Curry has been playing remarkably into his 30s. I mean, if you take a look at Curry, it's almost as if he's still performing just as well as he did when Kevin Durant was on his team. Yeah, his field goal percentage dipped this past year slightly, but for the most part, it wouldn't be the craziest thing to assume that Steph Curry could keep this going for another year or two. The question is when will his production drop off, and when will those Golden State Warriors picks become valuable? If you're the Utah Jazz, you're pretty much taking a gamble, trading Lauri Markkanen to a team, betting that they're going to be terrible in 2027. If the Warriors really wanted to be aggressive, they'd give up their 2029 unprotected first, but at that point, you don't really have much more assets to trade from there. Another team that they could trade with is obviously the San Antonio Spurs. I don't think the Spurs would be gatekeeping their picks nearly as much, primarily because they have Victor Wembanyama on a rookie scale contract. They can make the most of this situation over the next 3 years. You can bring in players that deserve max money as a result of it. You don't really see this happening in the NBA. You'll see this happen in the NFL when a quarterback is drafted. You have 4 years or 5 years on an undervalued contract to get him the best players possible around him, and that's typically what teams do. But the Spurs have this unique opportunity with Wemby Wemby, where they could trade for a player like Lauri Markkanen. And the assets that they have are insane. I mean, in next year's draft alone, they have Atlanta's unprotected first round pick, Charlotte's top 14 protected first round pick, and a Chicago top 10 protected first round pick. But the very next year, they have Atlanta's pick swap, they have their own first round pick, and they have 5 second round picks. The Spurs have picks moving on all the way to 2030 when they have Dallas's first round pick. It's kind of crazy. So do you decide to go with San Antonio and a draft pick heavy offer, because the San Antonio Spurs not only have the ability to match Lauri Markkanen's low salary, but they could also give you great draft compensation in return. But this is where things get complicated. We didn't even discuss why a trade hasn't occurred yet. Lauri Markkanen is in a very unique situation. You see, next season's trade deadline is February 6th. That's 8 days before All-Star Weekend. This is important because Markkanen can't be traded for 6 months after signing an extension in Utah. 6 months after August 6th happens to be February 6th, which means that Lauri Markkanen would only be able to be traded on one day next season, and that's February 6th. If Lauri Markkanen signs a contract on August 7th, then he won't be eligible to be traded until after the 2024 to 2025 season. At that point, Lauri would be 28 years old, which really isn't the biggest deal, but it's definitely something that complicates things, because currently, if you want to trade for Lauri, you have to give up contracts that match his current contract, and he's currently not making that much money. The man has an average salary of $16.8 million a year, and that's why a trade hasn't happened yet. Primarily because, according to Mark Stein, the Utah Jazz would have a difficult time finding a potential trade destination for Markkanen, and more than one rival team has shared the observation that it would be difficult for the Jazz to trade him in the short term, even if they wanted to. It obviously complicates the Jazz's efforts to get a trade package in return for Markkanen, on the level of Brooklyn's haul for Mikal Bridges when Markkanen is not under team control for more than a season, and when his salary is relatively low. They have a much better chance to command a Bridges-style offer with future draft picks like New York agreed to furnish the Nets if Markkanen is signed to an extension. Meaning that there's only one day next year that Markkanen could potentially be traded if this scenario is fulfilled, and it seems like that would be option number 3. Keeping Markkanen either until the trade deadline, where you could trade him for a day, or until next offseason, where you could probably get better players in return for Markkanen. But that also depends on whether or not Utah wants to take on tremendous salary in return for Lauri Markkanen, because up until now, the only thing you can really get for Lauri is good draft picks. It really depends on what Danny Ainge wants at this stage. Personally, as an NBA fan, I'd love to see him get traded to the Warriors or the Spurs, and I think the Spurs can easily make it worth the Utah Jazz's while, but it makes a lot of sense for the Jazz to also keep Lauri at this stage. Brett Siegel also mentioned a multi-team trade in which the Warriors would deal Andrew Wiggins in a different trade to get more draft assets for Utah in order to get Markkanen. They would then give up Moses Moody, pick swaps, and the expiring contracts of Kevon Looney and Gary Payton II in order to get him. So there are 3 options. It's either trade him to the Warriors, trade him to the Spurs, or keep him and trade him either on the one day that you can during the trade deadline or next offseason, in which you would need to get contracts that would match his salary. Let me know in the comment section down below, what do you guys think the Jazz should do? Personally, I hope he gets traded, because that'd be the most interesting scenario, especially to the Spurs. It would rocket the Spurs to the top of the Western Conference, in my opinion, but I'd like to hear what you have to say. Aside from that, I'm your boy Mike, and I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.